we could take a look at the idea of decision making. So you could say that from the time we wake up in the morning until the time we go to bed at night, it's incalculable how many decisions we make. I mean, if you just think of going in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, I mean, physically, you're moving tiny objects continually over, say, a 10-minute period. God knows what you're thinking about the night before, and the dreams and the feelings and the day that you're imagining before you. You can imagine how many decisions you might be making literally within a 10-minute period in the kitchen while you're making the tea, or etc. And you could say, in a sense, that's an overload situation for a human being. So both having an inundation of information, if you're open to the internet, for example, but just TV, radio, you've had the inundation of information, and you might say within that field of information, whether it's coming from the social media or from the internet in general, you think of all the things that you can think of that you're interested in, that catch your eye, that seem to matter in society. I mean, all those things are endless, and yet you want to make decisions about things or formulate opinions about things from all of this information, things that actually matter. And because society, in terms of the network of communication that's open to every individual on the planet, then to discriminate between what's actually seriously going on, what's seriously a fact, and what seriously is a factor for our well-being and survival. I mean, if you think of the general culture over the last 5,000 years, so you might go into the Louvre in Paris, or the British Museum and its library, and realise that everything within that library and within that museum going back 5,000 years has significance and value for human culture, for human tradition. And you think of all the individuals who have spent their lives producing that material, and if you think of the world today with over 7 billion people on the planet, you could say, which of those people are seriously engaged in culture? And then you could ask, well, what is culture in terms of post-World War II? So after World War II, you got what is pop culture. You get pop art, popular music, and then rock and roll and jazz and all of that kind of thing. And you could say, where are the substantial cultural figures who are giving insight into the nature of culture, and that insight into poetry, music, art, literature, that insight into that field of knowledge, or those fields of knowledge, really are to enable the reader, the person listening to the music, etc., to actually divine the essence and the meaning of that cultural form, that cultural product, so that you want the perfume of that product, the essence, the soul essence of that construct of knowledge, to convey the numinous nature of wisdom. Now, if you compare that limited output of a few individuals on this planet who are producing actual cultural forms that actually matter and transform consciousness over the past 5,000 years, for example, and what you might call general information. So you have general psychological, social, political information. You have information about the field of science and the implications over the next 50 years if we develop certain technologies which might even threaten the autonomy of human beings, so that the super intelligent machines can supersede individual brain capacity. Then if people are made redundant in many respects, so they literally have nothing to work for, then what would you imagine that kind of person, without needing to develop anything culturally, and is just open to internet information and that kind of thing, that's their kind of lifestyle. And even a lot of public intellectuals now, they more or less function within that kind of social media, and they're regurgitating a lot of information from a historical point of view in their argument, and by the time they're actually discussing the deeper level meaning and philosophical insight, it's just saturated in all of the statistics, it's saturated in all the information. Me, for example, my relationship to nature, I would say pretty much has absolutely nothing to do with information, because I don't take in any information at all on nature. I actually refuse to do so because I literally don't want to. I just want to be with nature as nature, with no filter, no aesthetics, no romantic, no sentimentality, with animals and pets and everything. No, that is just nature. And even the idea of knowledge about nature in a scientific sense, I don't want to know that either. I don't want to know the behaviour of birds and this, that and the other, what science is collated and all the information and data. I don't want to know anything from scientists, I don't want to know anything from naturalists about nature. That's my personal view. And even within a shamanistic situation, a more magical shamanistic situation, which would be more animistic and pagan, I'd have a lot of trouble looking at nature from a pagan shamanistic point of view, because I see nature in a very factual, realistic light, which really doesn't involve my consciousness. It's purely what I would call holistic perception of nature as a whole, and there's no consciousness filter, there's no thought, there's no analysis, there's no comparison, there's no, you might say, subjective like or dislike about nature on any level. There's no judgment. So as I say, I just look at nature holistically and focus on this and that which happens spontaneously, and I have absolutely no opinion about nature. And I think in the same way, the spiritual interest that I have doesn't depend on information and doesn't depend on knowledge. So that's another area. Nature and spirituality, in both cases, don't depend on any belief system, any power structure, any authority, any expertise at all. So you might say in between spirituality and nature, you could say, or body and spirit, is consciousness and psyche. Now in consciousness and psyche, you could say information and knowledge are inseparable within memory. So the memory you have about the world, unless you're a specialist, is just an admixture of information and knowledge. And people probably don't really think that much about the difference between knowledge, which is highly systematized intellectually, and information that is really more random and is more unstructured. Now, some people don't like unstructured information. They like a context, and they want to be critical of opinion. And so you might say in the academy they play down the role of information, and a lot of young people, that their exposure to the internet means that pretty much what they know about the world will be based on information. And so their kind of conversations will be based on sporadic opinion, whereas two more intellectual people will consider ideas as having relevance to the future of society, to the future of culture, and not just a kind of collective conversation and a sharing of information, which is pretty much the social media and the internet. mean, consciousness for each person is a highly complicated affair. So even the most uneducated person that's open to television, radio, the internet, etc., even the most uneducated person is motivated at least by a level of information that puts them in touch with a much wider world, and the sense that they're at least on the periphery of what matters. And then you have people in the centre that say depend on expert information or expert knowledge within government, etc., within business and the professional classes, which are more the educated classes. So you could say the educated classes that say within politics they have to dumb down the knowledge into information when they go on the social media, and they use statistics and generalizations and buzzwords and keywords and things like that. And so in the issue, say, between religion and science, you could say they're both monolithic systems of knowledge, and they're competing for the world stage, you might say. And I think if you ask the average person about science, I think that technologically people will obviously feel very positive about the resources within society, and yet there's the shadow, there's the deeper level memory, the more feeling level, the more non-intellectual, the more feeling level, where there obviously be the shadow side of the world wars in the 20th century, and the development of military weapons and the nuclear power stations, and there'd just be the shadow side. So there's always the shadow side of what is good, and a cautionary tale about being careful about the ethics of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence and quantum computers, etc. So, you know, the exposure of every human being to a quite generalized information about the world will probably cultivate a kind of level of anxiety. So there'd be probably a level of anxiety about the future based on that generalized information, which I think will confuse rather than bring order to one's consciousness, whereas the more knowledge-based systems bring more of a sense of seriousness and stability within, so that the feeling level will be less anxious, and yet maybe there'd be some level of skepticism and doubt and caution. And it's easy to frighten an anxious person if you've got the populace in a state of anxiety about the future of technocracy, for example, the ethical issues, and you keep on reinforcing that information, then it's quite easy to tip the anxiety level over into the fear level, especially with terrorism. So the psychosocial aspect of fear and terrorism then is utilised by the powers that be to gain authority and to heighten political awareness about the problem of terrorism, simply as a means of keeping alive the negativity of the information that's making people anxious about the future. I mean, my general response, which is probably consistent throughout my life, has been that I've not felt anything from the external world, the society I've grown up in, mainly in England and also in America. But I as a person have never felt threatened by any political, scientific, social, psychological activity or events in the world. And no cause for alarm. And I think that's got a lot to do with the fact that I haven't exposed myself to any form of social media information about life, about living, about the world. So if I get peripheral information about various malevolent, violent, warlike situations, then that's no surprise. I mean, I just think that's human nature, that's the way it's always been. So I didn't really need that information, or the latest, flood, or the latest hurricane, or earthquake, and that kind of thing. It seems to me almost banal to make an issue out of those things. So my sense of the world being a place that isn't threatening, I think that implies that I don't feel that human beings are threatening as a whole. So my sense of humanity isn't one of being dominated by some dictator, or dominated by some psychopath, or dominated by dangerous people. I don't feel that at all. But of course, within the hierarchy of society, I would imagine the people that get to the top can be quite dangerous people. but I think there's enough checking people out so that the way, say, the politics of on a global scale is going, I think that there are so many intelligent people keeping an eye on what's going on, and there's no reason for me to mistrust those people. It's the same way. I mean, you can go to the shops and you buy the food you need, and other things you can buy, and the internet's always running, etc. And the government's efficient and so forth and so on. And if you don't take in the information from the media, and you just go around where you live and just live a normal life on a very local level, and there's no overt dictatorship or overt domination from the state, as it were. So if you're living in England on an everyday level, there's absolutely no sense of threat in the wider world. Of course, that's unique to England as well, but all I'm saying is I'm still a human being on the planet. I understand human nature, and I trust that people all over the world are doing what the best they can to model society in an orderly way, and there's no reason to doubt that. And no doubt there will be certain individuals that will come along and cause problems, and they'll be sorted out. And in 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, life will continue, and what we call science will probably no longer be science as we know it. And maybe the way we factor ourselves in the world won't be dependent on information, on opinion, and on expertise. I mean, we function every day basically in reference to our memory. I mean, it's really memory which is the substrate of our consciousness. And most of us live true to our memory, which can be partly habitual, ritualistic, opinionated, based on beliefs and where we fit in the social hierarchy, our work, our interests, etc. And the idea that there's something quite different from memory that can operate in the human being, which you might say looks at life not through the lens of consciousness based on information or knowledge, hearsay or expertise, and that kind of consciousness which occupies most people's lives most of the time, that consciousness in response to the spiritual becomes actually negligible. So if I'm out walking by the river, consciousness becomes negligible. As I say, I don't take in information or knowledge concerning nature. So when I'm in nature, spiritually speaking, I can look at nature holistically. So you might say, there's myself perceiving nature without the lens of consciousness, without the lens of information or knowledge, so that you might say, in a certain way, I'm not dependent on having a specific identity that's rooted in the memory. So there's no what you might call the observer in memory, observing nature as the observed. There's no observer observed. There's simply holistic perception. And so you might say the observation is a direct communion between self and world, or self and nature. Another thing I find also in my life is that basically on meeting people, I tend not to consciously want to know a lot about people. I don't necessarily want to have a lot of information about people, for example. So I'm not interested in gossip or opinions or all kinds of, you might say, criticisms of an individual. No, I'd rather just sit down with an individual and talk to them in the sense spontaneously, and wherever the conversation goes, it goes. And I'm not really interested in what other people's opinions are about myself or the person I'm talking to. And the reason, you might say, there is a dialogue or conversation is not obvious unless it's a familiar relationship. If it's a familiar relationship, then there's a high level of recognition and repeatability of what you talk about because you know each other quite well. But if you're just meeting somebody in general for the first time, I would say that just as I regard nature as a whole without information or knowledge, so really when I look at another person, I don't need information and knowledge. I mean, the conversation will reveal what it reveals, and I may not want to talk to that person after a minute. I might decide not to talk to that person, or I might talk to that person for 20 minutes. This can take place when I'm walking by the river. And if I'm talking for 20 minutes, I'm not really concerned about the information and the knowledge within that conversation. That isn't really my priority. I think my priority is in the dialogue of making that dialogue, from my point of view, interesting to myself. So I'm not interested in the opinion of the other person. I'm interested in really how to make that conversation interesting. Now if you say, well, what would it be making that interesting? Well, I would say the same is when you walk in nature. You make it interesting by the way you perceive it, by the way you observe it. And if you see nature as a drama, which I do, it's a living drama. So likewise, you go to a film, that's a drama. You read a book, you have a conversation. And that dramatic element within the conversation, you might say, has a point, has a thread, it has a meaning within that context. And neither of the two people necessarily know what the outcome will be, what the meaning is. So I consciously am aware that when I'm in conversation, I'm making it interesting for myself. I'm not serving the other person. I'm not a recipient. I'm not a participant. I'm not an identity. I'm not a perspective. I'm not an observation. I'm engaged in the language and what that language can do within that conversation. And I will guide the conversation so I don't get bored and I don't get caught up in information. So you might say, I would tend to move the conversation in the direction of knowledge, so that would become more cultural. So you could say, because most people involved in culture are educated, then if you talk to an uneducated person, they may not be educated to know the references that you might use explicitly and implicitly from your readings, from your understanding of art and philosophy and history and mythology. So one particular person that I've talked to over the years, a person probably in their mid-80s now, well, when I might meet him when he's walking his dog, and immediately I find him interesting. I just find him and the way he thinks about things extremely interesting. And he can talk about being in the Second World War, or he could talk about when he got a job in a particular place, and the mechanics, you might say the mechanics of the job he had, and the literal mechanics of it, the mechanisms of it, but also the psychological and social situation in which he found himself, and the way that individual person dealt with the actual situation, which he found very interesting, and when he told me, I could see that the way his mind worked, that he needed, no matter what situation he found himself in, he needed to make it interesting to his way of thinking. So it wasn't so much that he had political, scientific, religious, psychological opinions, or that he knew very much about that kind of thing. But I would say what was interesting about this particular person, and I've met quite a few other people like him, is that when you get a very individual person who likes thinking about things in a quite subtle way, then you'll find within those people that haven't read books, they're not particularly educated, but you'll find a kind of thinking that's very implicit in culture. So when you think of the high-level educated thinking that goes into philosophy and art and music and science and religion within academia, well, all those mechanisms of thought, I think they do come out of a populace of people that aren't educated but have within their thinking process very archaic, very arcane ways of thinking about a subject or thinking about the way things work. And you don't necessarily find those people in the social media. You don't find those people on the world stage. So really they're anonymous people who are living interestingly intelligent lives, and yet that intelligence isn't celebrated. They haven't left any documents, they haven't left any record of the way they think. And so, again, it's things like this which tell me that whether it's information from the internet or it's knowledge from experts, and they're often polarized, the masses that are uneducated and the few that are educated properly. And then you get people, as I say, ordinary people, thinking in very intelligent, interesting ways about their individual lives, that say to me that human intelligence is not about IQ, is not about expert systems. It's something innate and inborn in people, and that kind of intelligence doesn't depend on politics, religion or science or even institutions, but exists in people, for example in the third world, or people that are not in a highly civilized situation. And that kind of intelligent human being interests me because there's a certain autonomy, a certain individuality, a certain freedom within the individual that the state or the church or technocracy and super intelligent computers and all these things that depend on highly sophisticated systems of knowledge kind of overlook a kind of intelligence that isn't really interested in dominating the world or controlling the world or imposing belief systems of science and religion and so forth and so on, and that people are quite capable of being intelligent, and that ordinary life is what goes unnoticed, and is a curious fact. It's a very curious fact. So if you look at that idea from a spiritual point of view, which is my point of view, which is not religious, and so spirituality is really, you could say, a body of knowledge which is part of a living tradition. So spirituality is something you live. And I find that these autonomous individuals that I consider have a very interesting, intelligent way of looking at life, and that's very natural, then I think in my own life that has something to do with spirituality. You could say on one level it has more to do with spirituality than either science or religion, in the sense that it's not strictly a belief system based on a system of knowledge which is being cultivated by a hierarchy. It's the freedom of the individual to think their own thoughts, and that those thoughts are intelligent and reveal to that individual a kind of understanding of language, understanding of the world through their thinking process, which is very human-based. It's based on something that's quite natural, quite spontaneous, and kept alive within a particular family or a particular family tree or ancestry in terms of inheriting psychic characteristics or psychic abilities. So I can imagine meeting this particular person, say we both died and I met him in another level, another dimension or whatever, I'm sure that individual will retain this unique way of thinking, and I'm absolutely sure that he would find the particular situation he finds himself in after death as something very interesting, that he will apply his intelligence to that situation and find something interesting within that situation he finds himself within, without being concerned with everyone else or even concerned about the big issue of life after death. But he will just carry on being interested in his immediate situation. And I find that's true for myself. that I'm very interested in the immediate situation. It's not about the bigger picture, it's not about world politics and world religion and all of that, but it's really the individual life in whatever situation, just living the life of an individual with an autonomy and freedom to think your own thoughts, and that's enough. There's something rewarding, there's something fulfilling, there's something something integral that makes you feel integrated, that makes you feel confident in your own self. And that is your ability to think your way through the day, in whatever situation you are, to think your way through the day as if all the small problems are being solved through a kind of intelligent thought which doesn't get caught up in the minor problems and deals with the major problems now and then, or the significant problems, or the critical problems, in a way that it is genuinely a problem to be solved, and that you use your intelligence to solve that problem. And I think people that do have that kind of intelligence, I think that all of the ups and downs of everyday situations, in whatever level, in the family, in the workplace, in society, whatever, I think that, and I certainly have met people like this, that the whole of their day moves in a momentum where there's always this sense of going forward, of not being held back by inefficient thinking or unintelligent thinking, you could say. And I'm using the intelligent thinking not in the IQ sense, but just the general sense of living an everyday life in all its subtlety, in all its variety of situations, inwardly and outwardly, and somehow navigating that quite complex system of psychosocial reality, and somehow having a key. It's like a key. The intelligence, say, of most people on the planet for the past, say, 30,000 years, the intelligence, what I'm talking about, is like a key. And that key, you might say, is a kind of insight that is intelligent, and it's really fundamentally a spiritual based perception. So I'm saying the natural intelligence that everyone's endowed with as a human being at their birth is a key to solving the problems of everyday life. And that way of thinking, but I'm also implying feeling, emotions, intuition. I'm using thinking more as a perception of like the process of living and all the complicated things in consciousness. So it's a matter of thinking clearly, and that could be conceptual that you have a kind of overview of the day ahead of you, or you have an insight into a situation. So I'm saying that intelligent insight is a spiritual perception, and everyone's endowed with that spiritual perception, and that's not the same as being endowed either scientifically or religiously. It's simply a fact of our intelligence, which I'm saying isn't a matter of evolution, isn't a matter of the evolution of the brain and the body, but is actually the intelligence that's coming from a spiritual dimension via consciousness, which produces intelligent culture, which are intelligent systems of knowledge, which serve very specific functions. But on the everyday level, the individual person has a spiritual intelligence that gives insight into the problems that are manufactured every single day by memory and consciousness in the world. And I'm saying that spiritual intelligence may not be translated in religious terms as being something transcendent to life after death. It doesn't have to imply that spirituality equals life after death. You can follow that investigation if your experiences take you in that direction. But if your experiences don't take you in the direction of, say, thinking about something beyond bodily death, or something beyond the brain, or something even beyond consciousness, still, in a very everyday sense, a basic intelligent sense, I think you can apply the word spiritual to differentiate that from consciousness and its systems of knowledge. And therefore, my parents, having no religion whatsoever in their life, just lived their life existentially. They lived and they died, and that was it. But that doesn't mean to say that they may not have had thoughts about what happens after death, but they weren't an issue. Because they weren't religious, they didn't have that indoctrination. Therefore, even if they had those thoughts, unless they discussed it with other people and developed those thoughts, they would just simply be thoughts about the world, or thoughts about what would that be like, or what would this be like if there wasn't war, if there was, if we didn't have this or we did have this. No, it's simply peripheral thoughts that my parents might have had about life after death, but wouldn't have been an issue. It wouldn't have had a psychological effect of security and insecurity, that kind of thing. And I don't think what I'm talking about, this innate intelligence that's affected the thinking of most people in the way they deal with everyday reality. And I think that I haven't come across any study of what I'm talking about. And I've certainly met a lot of people that function in this way, in a very specific way of showing a highly intelligent kind of perspective on the most everyday mundane things, like most people gossip about, or just things that happen in the workplace, in the office, in relationship, whatever, but very, very basic stuff, but a highly intelligent way of rendering that information, or those life experiences. So you might say that kind of person would be quite canny, And when you say quite canny, you mean they've got a kind of sixth sense, in the sense that they know things other people don't know, and they seem to get themselves out of situations, or they don't get themselves caught up in situations that other people might fall prey to, like certain habits, certain addictions, certain obsessions, certain indulgences, certain extravagances. So no, I would say the people I've met that show that kind of intelligence are quite moderate people, quite modest people, and people that know that they're intelligent. They know they're intelligent, and you might say they're kind of teachers in their own way. It is a kind of teaching. In fact, when you listen to people like that, there is a sense that they're teaching you something, but they're not teachers. They've never even thought of being a teacher, but there's just something in the way they talk, and where they're explaining something to you that they figured out. It's like they figured something out about life, and they're telling you or sharing it with you, and in conversation. So you're bringing in your intelligent perspective, they're bringing in their intelligent perspective, and you're working together and weaving it together. And I think there's the sense that if you listen to each other and really understand what's being said, then somehow there is a kind of communion between the two people that is spiritually intelligent. So you could say the spiritual factor would be the harmonious sharing of a kind of wisdom. It is a kind of wisdom, what you might call in a more general sense, people that are wise to life, have a certain kind of innate wisdom, an innate insight into the most ordinary things in life, and yet make those ordinary things in a certain kind of way quite extraordinary. No, I mean, in terms of, say, for example, my idea of life after death. So my idea of life after death isn't the religious idea of God and the devil, or surviving death and, going towards paradise or something like that. No, my idea is that what my thoughts would be is, what am I going to do? If I do survive death, then I would want to continue to be the person that I am. I want to continue being interested in whatever the situation is. So it's not like, oh, I'm immortal, I'm going to survive death, and all the drama, the religious drama, and all the expectations of all things beyond the grave, all that kind of mediumistic talk. No, none of that would interest. That's all information. What would interest me is what the next situation is going to be. So in my life, when I'd moved from, say, England to America, and I got involved with spiritual things, I met lots of different people, lots of different levels of society, etc., all the books. But in each situation, I was finding out what interests me. Why was I going to a certain place, and what did I want? and what was the point. And so in each situation I would simply relate to the situation, relate to the people, not be attached, not be dependent, not feel that that was like anything final, but I'd go into a situation and come out of the situation. And that's what I'm saying. If I die and I go into a situation, then I'll just be myself and then deal with that situation. But I won't be worried about everybody else, or we're in a different level and we've left the earth, and we're in the cosmos, or we're in the psychic dimension or dream dimension or something. No, it won't. That won't be really what will occupy my mind. What will occupy my mind are the thoughts that I want to think that have specific meaning to me at that particular time. So I'm living here on the earth. I've not left this particular place where I'm living for nearly 20 years. So I mean, even going to London, which is only 50 miles away, I haven't been there for about 20 years. And I haven't been anywhere outside of this city for 20 years. I mean, literally. And yet I travelled in America, travelled to Europe and all over to India. But I don't miss that. I don't feel, oh, I used to be adventurous, I used to be this or that, and I read all these books and met all these significant people. So none of that means anything to me anymore. And I just live on an everyday level. And I really just, you might say, keep alive my way of looking at the world. I mean, that's all I've really got, is my way of looking at the world. And my way of looking at the world doesn't depend on books anymore, doesn't depend on what I've done in the past. And it's not that dissimilar to the idea that you have a garden and you look after the garden. So I look after myself primarily by being intelligent. And I don't have to qualify that intelligence. I'm not answerable to anybody for that kind of intelligence. And you could say probably the element that is probably spiritual about that kind of insight and intelligence is probably what might be called creative. So I would say the intelligent people I meet on an everyday level, you might say, who have no specific education or no specific cultural development, and yet have this sense of insight and a kind of world-wise wisdom, as it were. And I would say probably the element at work is what we call creativity, the ability to see the world every day in a slightly different way, in a way that holds your interest, keeps a narrative going within yourself and your relationship to the world. And so it is a kind of storytelling, it's a kind of narrative, it's a kind of life story with that major ingredient, which is, you might say, wisdom. Wisdom in its very non-philosophical, non-religious sense, or you might say more neutral, spiritual sense. And that is what they used to call it intuition or divining, reading the inner meaning of things, the inner essence, the kind of soul essence of poetry, the soul essence of a relationship, the soul essence of any situation that you find yourself in.